racism and Islamophobia can determine our physiological health, our bodily health. And this for a number of reasons and a number of conditions, whether it is heightened blood pressure, lower birth weight for babies, whether it is premature aging or even death. And this is because it creates a huge load on the body, a huge stress and exhaustion, and this when it doesn't inflict traumatic experiences. So my question is, what should we know? And how can we heal? And how can we manage these kind of things? Hello and welcome. My name is William. I am a researcher in sociology at the University of Warwick in the UK, and this is a series about my latest book, Muslims in the Neoliberal Empire, about how the society colonizes us and what can we do about it. And if I have this comical looking microphone, it's because it's very, very windy today. And you might also recognize the location we're at because it is Royal Earlswood Park. I haven't chosen this location at random because this was a Victorian asylum. So if people had mental health issues, they would be sent there, or even if they were completely healthy because the families wanted to get rid of them, they would just pay the asylum and for their relatives to stay and never to hear about them again. Of course, mental health care has evolved a lot since then, and especially when it comes to Muslims, we have much more and better tools to deal with our issues, not mentioning mainstream therapies that are trying to adapt themselves to Islamic frameworks and cultural specificities, but also people who are working on the ground at building from scratch Islamic-based therapies. Let's go through some terms together. When the body is exposed to sustained and long periods of stress, it builds up what is called the allostatic load, which is basically the wear and tear of the body. So when this allostatic load builds up, so when the body has more wear and tear, it weakens the immune system and people become prone to infections. And studies show that more people are exposed to racism or very precarious living conditions, the more the allostatic load builds up and the more they are actually prone to infections. And one example is what we saw during the COVID pandemic. Why was it people from minority backgrounds who were the most affected in the first place? So if you live a tough life, the more you're going to get vulnerable to these kind of infections. And this has led to a medical definition of racism because, racism has many different definitions, whether it is economic, geography, sociology. But here, in medical terms, let me read it for you. Racism is the state-sanctioned and or extra-legal production and exploitation of group-differentiated vulnerability to premature death. Racism induces premature wear and tear, premature death, and because racism is a system, so this is why it says it's a state sanction. Or in terms of figures, people from the Black, South Asian and Muslim diasporas are 3 times more likely to suffer from mental health issues compared to the average population. Research shows how racism and Islamophobia increases feelings of depression and anxiety for Muslims, and this especially after 9/11 has completely exploded. And what we see in terms of healthcare is that there is an overrepresentation of people from minoritized background in mental health services. As an example, in 2010, 23% of mental health patients in England and Wales were from Black minority and ethnic groups, while this group, this particular demographic, makes only 14% of the population. So those who have experienced verbal abuse and attacks are between 3 and 5 times more likely to suffer from depression or psychosis. And when it comes to counterterrorism policies, I refer to chapter 2 of my book. So study shows, and I recommend the work of the amazing psychotherapist Tarek Younis, these counter-extremism policies create a diabolical loop, if you want, where people are targeted, people who have mental health issues or who are neurodivergent, who have like autism, Asperger's, they are more likely to be targeted by these policies, more likely to be deemed at risk of extremism. But then when they get referred, they get further traumatized because, incarceration, jail time, encounters with the police can be very, very traumatic for them. Not only overt racism or Islamophobia have an impact. It doesn't have to be verbal abuse, it doesn't have to be attacks. When someone makes a racist comment but it's passed off as a joke, but no, it's not a joke. It has an impact on people. So subtle or covert acts of racism contribute to 89% of reported race-based trauma. 89%. And no, it has nothing to do with people being oversensitive. It is how the brain is wired. This is how trauma works. This is how it is. So when it comes to these covert effects of racism, it comes with, for example, self-censorship or self-exclusion. You're not going to apply to job interviews. You're not going to go to certain social circles because you fear being rejected, being traumatized, being abused. So it puts an extra burden on people who have to avoid certain situations for them not to be wounded again. And this comes on top of the insecurities of not being in a stable financial situation, not having access to the job market as everyone does, not having a safety net, or just not having access to a mentor or a sponsor in the workplace. And we've seen in previous videos that if you want to progress in your career, you need now to have a mentor, someone who will guide you, someone who will show you the tricks of the trade, basically. And people from minorities background don't have access very easily to these kind of things. It can also come from people who fail at mimicking dominant norms. If, for example, you cannot access the pub because you just can't, you don't drink alcohol, and you miss on lots of job opportunities or career opportunities, that produces anxiety. And research has also shown that all these traumatic experiences, they have real consequences on the way people deal with their interpersonal relationships, or relationships with their spouse, relationships with their parents, or even relationships with their kids as parents. What research says is that these wounds can be passed on to future generations. And this is where we talk about intergenerational trauma. So these are not passed on genetically, it doesn't go into the genes, but it is socially transmitted. For example, how many of our parents had a healthy relationship? I saw my parents since childhood arguing, shouting, slamming doors, being very worried about the finances all the time, being worried about the far-right parties coming into power all the time. And this kind of environment has an effect on the kids. And this is where intergenerational comes into play. So my parents already are traumatized because of the experience of migration, the insecurity of the job market, financial insecurity, insecurity on the streets, or racism. And my parents are Polish, for those who don't know. And when you grow up in such a broken household and a dysfunctional family, you are likely to project your own wounds on other people, because it will look for similar patterns in the people you are dating or marrying, and the way you parent your own kids. Because you haven't seen any other example of a healthy relationship or healthy parenting, you are more likely to inflict harm on other people, even if you don't want to. Because my parents didn't have any tools to understand these dynamics, like racism, financial insecurity. They didn't have any tools to protect themselves from all these harms, and they didn't have tools to navigate the society so that they could avoid these kind of challenges, and tools to regulate themselves so they wouldn't argue in front of the kids. They would make better financial decisions. Joy Leary, studying black families, has coined the term post-traumatic slave syndrome when it comes to black communities. The fact that generations down the line, events like the slave trade has long-lasting impacts. But then what happens is very, very interesting. They internalize whiteness and argue similarly that Muslims can internalize Islamophobia. And so in Elaine's work, black people create a white superego. The oppressor becomes a superego. They become obsessed with the idea of the oppressor. And what does it mean? I will quote her directly. It is a syndrome of preoccupation with the white other. Elaine argued that people impacted by transgenerational trauma adopt a split personality. And one of these personalities is what she calls the internal oppressor. So what is the internal oppressor? It is, she says, the part of the self which perpetuates internalized oppression, which is the process of absorbing the values and beliefs of the oppressor and coming to believe that the stereotypes and misinformation about one's group is true. And this is something that has been described by other researchers and thinkers. And one example is, for example, when Muslims internalize Islamophobia, internalize the narrative that Islam is violent by nature, that all Muslims are uncivilized people and Islam needs reforming, or that Israel is completely right to wipe off all the Palestinian population. And you have Muslims thinking like this. So when we talk about either coconuts or people who replicate oppression of Muslims on their own communities, these are people who have internalized oppression. That is metacolonialism, but in psychological terms. People who were once oppressed, who then become oppressors in turn and oppress their peers. So talking about Muslims who oppress their peers, there is also the very sad phenomenon of spiritual abuse that has gained popularity in the past years. Why? Because people have been more prompt at holding people of power into account. And so when we talk about spiritual abuse, what does it mean? Spiritual abuse is something which is across all religious communities, whether it is Christian, Jewish, Muslim. What happens is, I think one of the best definitions I found is on the website in Shaykh's Clothing, which defines as using religious authority for personal gain, ulterior purpose to bully, harass and control others. It is very similar to cults because people tend to idolize all these YouTube preachers, these scholars that are in the spotlight, and when you idolize something, you personally identify with them. So any criticism of them becomes a personal attack, and this is why often people are in complete disbelief. Oh, this person has done something, and so it's impossible. They've done so much for the Ummah. Never they would do something like that. Even when the police knocks on their door, they say, "Oh, it's maybe a Zionist conspiracy, something like that." Well, no. These people broke the law, they committed crimes, and they have to be held into account. And this kind of idolization of these superstar imams and YouTube preachers leads to spiritual abuse because some people, people have some degree of greed and selfishness, and it's very easy if you are like for X and Y reason to take advantage of people who blindly follow you because you can tell them to do anything, whether it is sexual favors, whether it is like so many scandals about all these charities and influencers who stole zakat money, created fake charities to steal zakat money, or just to just lure people into giving them money for personal use. And the problem is this kind of manipulation and abuse doesn't only break the relationship between Muslims and the extended community, but also believers and God, because religion, faith is a social experience. So when the people around you cannot be trusted, or people in positions of authority, then you get to question everything. It breaks so many things internally in people's mind. So there's two organizations I wanted to highlight in this quest for justice. It is first in Shaykh's Clothing, which is a website, and like a few lawyers which are helping people struggling with these issues, because as a victim it's very hard to make a move, especially if you are being wronged by people in immense positions of power and authority and fame or wealth. And the other organization is FACE, which is US-based and works similarly on exposing figures that have been, not exposing, it's more supporting the victims, because then, it has, people have to go through the legal process, and it can be very difficult. So FACE is there to support people going through the legal process as well, gathering evidence and so on. And yes, because when people do harm to the public, the public needs to be warned at some point. And they've received a lot of backlash for the reasons I've mentioned. Humans in general are very adverse at holding people of power into account, because many identify with them, and the argument that they've done so much for the Ummah and stuff blinds people to the extent that we cannot imagine them doing anything bad. But humans are not prophets, and I think this is the main problem with our consumerist social media culture. We erect people as prophetic figures, as idols, some almost to the point of worshipping them, and this shouldn't happen. Because if we start worshipping them to the level of prophets or gods, this is when we become blind to their wrongdoings while they are only human. This is the good news part of the video, the initiatives that do something. This is, since the 2000s in the UK, at least. I don't know about the US, but there's lots of work that has been done to adapt current mainstream mental health services to different cultures, ethnicities, religions, specifically Muslims. So you had culture-sensitive services in the 2000s like Rethink 2005, or faith-sensitive services like Mind 2014, but also you have Muslim mental health care organizations which have been around for a very long time, and among them you have Black Women's Health and Family Support 1982, the Muslim Youth Helpline 2001, Muslim Women's Helpline 2001, or Sakoon, Islamic Counselling 2006. So there's been work that has been done to adapt mainstream therapies to certain cultural frameworks, to the Islamic framework. So we are seeing now the emerging field of Islamic counseling, Islamic therapy. What does it mean? So back in the days we had, researchers, Muslim psychologists, providing guidelines to therapists that should appreciate the Islamic framework. People who have trying to create a synergy between therapy and religious organizations, imams, which means taking culturally informed interviews where the therapist is also receptive on all the cultural, religious, spiritual elements in the patient's life and try to understand them, not judge them. It is, in medical terms, taking into account subjective explanatory models, the collective dimension, the interdependence. But then, and this is where it gets really, really interesting, is you have researchers, psychologists, psychotherapists like Abdullah Rahman, who have created from scratch, from the ground, an Islamic model of psychotherapy and counselling. And I can mention some other therapists that have tried and experimented with hybrid models or completely new models, such as Ghazal Amer at Leeds, or Muslim psychotherapist Rabia Malik, who opened the Marlborough Center for Islamic-Based Intervention. I don't think it's around anymore, but that's the main project back in the days. But you have lots of independent, individual Muslim psychotherapists and psychologists out there. The problem is, back in the days with the elders generation, mental health, psychotherapy was kind of taboo because people didn't really understand. People would say, it's a lack of iman, it's because you're not praying enough, it's because you don't have enough faith, basically. And often people in their mother tongues didn't have words to describe things such as depression, stress, trauma. People would say things such as pagal hai. They didn't have any other words for describing certain conditions. But now I think it's evolving, especially with social media. There's an increased awareness, and people realize that mental health is just like when you have a physical wound, when you have a broken arm, a broken leg, you cannot function normally. You need, first of all, to take care of these wounds. You need to heal, and the mind works in a very similar manner. It's just not as tangible, as real and it's painful, but not as real and visual as a broken leg, for example. So this is why you had lots of reluctance, but the concept is the same. You need to fix yourself if you want to flourish. Or I can mention back in the days, people who would attribute certain conditions to jinn possession. Semi-funny story, there's a guy I knew in France, he had some troubles at some point, and he was from Algeria, and what the family did is they sent him back to Algeria to see some Shaykh, and the therapy was he would stand naked, stripped naked, in a dark room for 3 days without food, without water, and covered in olive oil. And that was the therapy for getting the jinn out of him. I don't know if you've heard something like that, but this is a real anecdote that happened to someone I know personally. And this has to be taken into account into the spaces we go to and live in, like whether it is the mosque, the madrasa, whether it is religious organizations, charities. Because the society has broken people to the extent of many of us, most of us, have probably some underlying trauma or very painful experiences that we haven't processed. And this affects everyone, our friends, our parents, our spouses, our children, everyone around us. But sometimes we just cannot, we can't self-diagnose like that because we don't have all the tools. It's very hard for people sometimes to recognize that, they might be depressed, or they might be projecting something, or they might have some unresolved wounds. It only appears in the form of arguments. It appears in the form of isolation, voluntary isolation, or many very subtle acts, and which people only figure out there is something more underneath, maybe much later. There's also not an easy access to mental health services, and people don't see it as a priority because, again, it's not very visual, it's not very graphic. And this is why we need to work on the accessibility of mental health in healthcare systems. Even in the UK, where people can have access to free healthcare, they may be redirected to some inadequate therapies which are not, don't understand much about culture or religion, or it can just take a very, very long time before people see a therapist, and the only way is to see a private one, which costs a lot of money most of the time. And all the initiatives I talk about in my book are about actually healing with it, whether it is in contact with the environment, reconnecting with the arts, culture and heritage. Because one of the main ailments of the society is the culture of division. We divide each other, divide everything, separate everything from everything, and think we can just live in a vacuum. We can, if we are broken, we can fix ourselves. This is a culture of individualism. While no, we are not meant to function like this. We are meant to be in community, surrounded by people of different generation, different social and cultural backgrounds, different opinions, and we need to make this work all together. But we have lost the art of knowing how to do this. There's no community anymore. There's no ummah anymore, and because people have been broken for generations. No financial stability, no representation, no visibility, no support, nothing, and nobody gives us the tools to know how to navigate society. So of course people are going to be broken and then break other people in turn. And the first step, the very, very first step for us to undertake in order to escape all this and start actually building instead of continuing dividing and breaking, is to heal, making sure that, just like you make sure your car is like everything up to date, everything clean, everything functional. We need to do the same thing with our bodies. Of course, we're not machines, it's more complex, but that's the simplest analogy I can think of. If we want to run, if we want to work, or if we want to function, if we want to be a mercy, if we want to be stewards, khalifa towards each other, we need to be healthy, we need to be functioning, and for this we need to heal from whatever wounds we have. I'll stop there, we'll continue in some other videos, but thank you very, very much for watching, and as always, take care of yourselves and each other.